So when I started producing back in 2009 on my parents' dingy Windows home computer, literally looked like a giant box. I thought the key to making great music was basically to have a bunch of cool looking plugins. And if you look on any future music magazine or production forum, you'll pretty much see this for yourself. But it wasn't until many years later I actually radically shifted my approach to music production, and I started to focus on what actually mattered. And I realized that sample selection was far, far, far more important than any plugin could ever be. So I've got two drum loops here, and I just want to show you the difference between them. So let's listen to the first one. It's just a drum loop in MIDI with a shaker. And let's listen to the second loop with a second shaker. So what is the difference between these two? Well, honestly, it's literally just sample selection. So as you'll see, the MIDI for this clip and this clip is literally exactly the same. The only difference here is that I've collapsed them. But the point here is that sample selection is everything, and you can get two very different characterized. These are basically two different genres. I want to show you that sample selection is important for the quality of your mixdowns. It's important for the type of style you're making. And it's just really important for the workflow and to make it fun while you produce. It sucks working with bad samples, right? The difference here is that drum kit A is literally just a default kit in Ableton, which is fine for certain styles. But if you're wanting to get like a more clean sound for a different type of music, then I've got a deliberately curated kit here with the second kit. I've literally dragged in these samples myself. There's not even any bus processing differences. There's not even any fancy, we're not using any of these sends or mastering. It's literally just the samples. So I'm going to dive into 4 different pillars that you need to know in order to nail your sample selection. Speaking of samples, if you want some free ones, head to the free downloads link in the description where you'll be able to get some free samples, PDFs, and a bunch more. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing you need to know with sample selection is you need good access. Now, this isn't a plug, this isn't a sponsored video, but I just want to show you a few examples of where you can get good sounds. Now, the best place to start is to check out your DAW and to see what sounds and samples are included. For example, Ableton has a few good default kits, but you'll often find that no matter what DAW you use, there is a point you reach where the samples that come with it don't cut it really. So unless you're making like Soulja Boy, music, which is just default stock FL samples. So this is where a service like Splice or LoopCloud comes into play. Now, the 4 main ones I recommend are Splice. This is what I personally use 99% of the time. It's got heaps of great packs across so many different genres that I like. So it's really fun to work with. And you can just download the exact samples you need without having to download full packs, which is great. If you're making dance-oriented music like house and techno, LoopCloud is great, not only because it's got samples that are really specifically dedicated to that, but also because it's got a great way of working with samples where you can layer and process them even before you get into the DAW with their built-in software, which is pretty cool. You can see that's it there. This guy's using it, which he seems to enjoy it. Noise is another great one. It also has kind of their own, sampler, which is pretty cool. I've downloaded a few off Noise before, and they have some great sounds. Just another option. And sounds.com is another one, which is the team at Native Instruments. I haven't used this one as much personally, but it definitely seems to be a good option. If you like to sample from old school tracks, I'll give a quick shout out to Tracklib, I think it is, sorry. I've done a review on these guys before. They have full songs, like old school songs that you can sample the drums from, etc. and sample full things from. So if you want to like download and buy the music and then use it as a sample, you can do that from there. The other option is literally just to Google like a good trap pack in your genre or whatever. Like, if you're making drum and bass, type in drum and bass, Like the point here is to just, I can't spell right. If you do go for the packs route, I recommend downloading like 5 to 10. You don't want to get too many, but you also want to have a few options in case, one doesn't quite work for certain sounds or something like that. It's good to have a bit of variety. It also helps you kind of create more of a unique sounds by layering them together, etc. Okay, so the second pillar of good sample selection is what I call sample referencing. Now, sample referencing is basically the same concept as a reference track, where you take a track and you pull it in and you reference what you're making against it. Now, I've got a cool track here loaded in from one of my friends, Winslow, and this is his latest track on Hospital Records called Breaking News with Track. It's a drum and bass track, and it sounds like this. I'll give it a little snippet. Hopefully I don't get copywritten stricken again. I really like the snare from this track. It's got like a nice kind of clap, kind of a bit of a Foley vibe to it. So I've gone ahead and ripped part of the snare. It's not perfect because it's got the background music in, but I can get a decent vibe for the tail, the head, and the body of the snare. So I can start to basically use this as a reference for my sample selection. Then what I can do is head to my, sample library or sample service and go to Splice. And the easiest way to do this is, by the way, is like to draw in a MIDI clip at C3 or whatever your root node is in your DAW, and basically just load in a sample. So I'm going to go ahead and look for a drum and bass snare. I'll go drums. I'll make sure I specify drum and bass. Maybe I'll type in clap instead because it's more of a clap. Now that I've got my MIDI loaded in, I'm looking for sample. The third thing here to do is to start to characterize what kind of sample you're looking for. This is really cool if you're using a reference because you can start to be like, okay, listening to the sample. And I hear it's kind of plucky and short, but it's got a bit of a clap sound to it. It's not a super heavy snare in the low end. It's more of a light kind of, tappy snare, I guess I would call it. And I can start to kind of remember that when I'm like referencing samples, and then when I'm bringing them in, I can kind of start to, see if that lines up. So I would describe the snare as snappy, bright, and short, and clappy. It's kind of got a clappy sound to it. So I'm going to kind of look for something that matches those words. If you struggle, you could probably pull up your notes app and, type in a few things like snappy, tight, short, clap, airy. So I'm going to keep looking and see what I find. I feel like this one here from this Neuro DMB pack is kind of somewhat on par. Might not be exact, but let's bring it in. And I'm just going to make sure it's snapped right on to the start of the sample. Might need a bit of a pitch up. Turn up in volume. It's not too far off there. It's got a bit more of a lower end, but this is a great starting point. We could look for a slightly different sample. So you can see here by simply defining the kind of characteristics like this snare. It's snappy, kind of a bit clappy. It says it's a clap in the sample. It's short. It's punchy, so it kind of matches up with those words that I use to describe. You've got to remember a sound kind of exists on 3 axes. So it's got frequency content, which is like, if I looked at like a spectrum analyzer or something like that. I can actually see that it kind of occupies a similar frequency range, which is pretty cool. It's a bit more of a boost in the low end on that snare, which is fine. We can sort that out later. The second thing is to look at the dynamics. We can see the dynamics of the sound compared to the original. This one's probably a little more body heavy, which we can solve with a bit of ADSR or fades. But it's kind of got basically a very similar dynamic. There's a bit of a punch at the start. We could even bring the start of this one forward, so it's kind of matching the dynamics there, but there's a similar level of dynamics. And then there's also the stereo field. This is where you can bring in something like Ableton's utility or whatever, utility kind of device that allows you to separate the mid and side signal and listen to what's going on the side channel to see if it's got enough stereo image. So we can see this one has a lot more stereo image. We could probably balance that down by bringing the width down. So that helps just kind of curate and get our sample a bit closer to what we're looking for. And that's what I like to call the 80% rule, is I want to get 80% of the way there with one sample if possible. Now, a lot of the time, like in this case, if I'm trying to recreate a specific sample or get close, which by the way, isn't always necessarily the point. Sometimes it's fine to get close, but you kind of don't want to be the exact same. But if you wanted to layer it up and get closer, this is where the fourth rule comes in. Now, I will mention here, this whole last process will take it to 100%. It'll take, your 80% sample to 100% sample if you want to layer it up. But the mistake a lot of producers make here is realizing that the sample they've chosen actually isn't 100% of the way there, or 80% of the way there. It's actually 60, 50, 40% of the way there. And what they do is they compensate with layering when really what you need to do is just find a different sample. So before I go ahead and layer up this sample, what I'm going to do is duplicate this, and I'm going to see if replacing the sample in general is going to help give me a different result. So I've actually just found this snare from a different pack that I've got in my default sample library as well, which is fine to dive into sometimes. In fact, I'm going to look at the frequency spectrum here. Okay, so they're kind of both similar. And now I'm thinking, I could replace this sample, but I'm actually thinking a better approach is to probably layer the two. Just kind of start with this one and layer this one in slowly. Maybe this one's probably better to be the dominant sample, actually. This one without it sounds pretty weak. But with both there, we're getting something a bit closer. I think, you can layer those samples up and you get a good result that was different to just both the original samples there. I kind of like to approach it like this. First, replace the sample if it's not working. Second, layer up the sample if it needs a little bit to take it to 100%, because that's going to do a lot more than trying to process a sample with like EQ and stuff like that, because you can only add frequencies that are already there. You can't really do that unless you're adding like saturation, and sometimes that's not always the answer either. So I think layering is a far better approach to fill in the gaps. But lastly, I think EQ and processing and that kind of thing can really help take it to 100%. So I just want to kind of bring the width of this sample back down a bit. And what I want to do as well is just kind of group these samples together. I noticed they're a bit too plucky, so I'm going to give it a bit of compression here pretty fast, just to kind of glue them together. And that softens the transient a bit more, which I really like. We can also probably EQ this one up just to give it a bit more of a punch in the low end, which I kind of like. Last thing I'll do is maybe also just use a transient shaper as well, just on the group to kind of shorten it a little more, which I kind of think it needs a bit less of a tail. And there, I actually really am happy with that sample overall. So following this process of having access to good sounds, referencing samples that you think are good from actual tracks and ripping them out, then describing it in your own ways so you can go and find your own samples. Then lastly, step 4, to go ahead and see if that's the right sample by replacing it or layering it and processing it to take it to 100%. That's how you can get really solid samples that, 1, are quality, 2, line up with what you want to do, and 3, make music production more enjoyable. Because as I said at the beginning of this video, good samples means it's better to make music with and it's more fun. So I really hope this process of sample selection has shown you the power of it. I really want you guys to be able to take this and run with it and use it in your own tracks. If you have any questions about this process, or if there's something to do with sample selection that I've missed, leave a comment below. Obviously this applies mostly to drums, but you can apply this to all sorts of sounds, whether it's pads, basses, or whatever. If you thought this video was helpful, like it so other producers will be able to see it as well. It really helps push it out there. And also subscribe for more content from the EDMProd team, and we'll be putting out videos pretty regularly. Yeah, that's all I have to say today. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.